about the JavaScript closure. Closure is a very important concept in JavaScript. If we look at from the W3 schools, the definition of closure, so they got quite a lot of information here. But what does really that mean? So I will use this example, this simple example. I will go through a bit more detail so we can really understand what that means. So this is a sample function, right? So it's add. So add is a function, and we define a count, and then this function will return another function. So so this is also a high order function, right? So when the function returns another function, so it's called high order function. So let's try to understand this a little bit more. So let's just use a console.log add. Right, so let's see what this add is. So yeah, so add is actually is just this part, right? So what we defined here. So then if we look at add with bracket, so what do you think this will be, right? So this actually is, we run this function. So we run this function, so what we got when we run this function actually returns this. Right, so that, let's see what we get here. Right, so that's what we got, which is this return. So let's clear this. Then the next one I want to try is, because this returns this function, so when we want to call this function, we need to put another bracket. So this is the way we call a high order function. So what do we think? We think this will return 1, right? So that's correct, because the initially the count is 0, then add by 1, then we return 1. So so what's going on here? So the interesting thing is, okay, to make people it's easy for us to understand. So I probably put a little bit break it down. Const. So we call the first level function, we call out function, right? And this function we call inner function. So if we look at here, what is the inner function? Return. So inner function actually return a function which add 1 on counter and return counter. So the issue is, if we want to call this inner function, basically we just put this is how we call it, but this function doesn't have count, right? So if we have function, we just run this function, it will throw error because the count is undefined. But in this case, because that's the concept closure, right? So this count defined on their parent. So even we only call this inner function, call this function, then we can still get a scope to access this count here. Right, so that's how this means. So if we say we run this, so you can see we got 1. So another interesting thing is, if we keep running this, if we run this again 3 times, right? Because we still call this inner function here, so this actually can keep this the value of this count. So if we run this 3 times, this is what we get. You'll see we have 1, 2, 3. Right. So there's another way we can run this is if we say we can use in the JavaScript is another thing called immediate invoke function expression. Right. So it's another way we can run this. For example, we define count instead of define count as function, we define count as immediate invoked function expression, which like this. Right. So let's see what again. Let's see what does this mean. So if we just console.log add, so we get this function, which is what we expected, right? Because this add is automatically run this function. When you run this function, it returns this. So then we can call this. Then, which means in this case we call this function. Right. So again, so even this function we didn't define count, but because the parent function has a count, so we still keep this value here. Right. So we still got this 1. So again, if we run multiple times, you can see we have 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So another interesting thing is if we don't use immediate invoked function, if we say we define add like this, right? Then if we call so basically we'll call this function, and then this function call another function, right? So that's higher order function. So if we do this, then we'll return 1, right? So we know that. So if we call this 3 times, so we got, right? So you may think then we get 1, 2, and 3, but that's not the case, because when we call this again, so this is already return another function. It's not the previous function anymore. So if we run this, you can see every time it's return 1. That's because every time when we call this part, it's actually get this new count, start from 0. There's another way to solve this issue. So we can say we can define as of previous what we did. We can define const x equal at alright. So then if we equal at, right? So in this case, x is actually this function. All right. Then we call x 3 times. Then we will get this count. Will keep the value. So if we say call x, we'll call x 3 times. Be remember, this is all about the inner function, right? So because x is already defined this inner function. So you got 1, 2, 3. However, if we defined like this, x equal at, then we involve like this. So you can expect, right? So this will return 1 1 1, not 1 2 3. Right. Hope this gives you a bit idea of enclosure.